Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents This Land is Our Land, The Struggle for a New Commonwealth by Jedediah Purdy. Narrated by Timothy Andrés Pabon. Preface. Homeland. The Search for a New Commonwealth. In the years that I have been an adult, homeland has grown from a word Americans did not really use to a slogan by which we are ruled. In the name of Homeland Security, at once an obsessive idea and a gigantic federal agency that polices the borders, guards the president, the Secret Service, and responds to or neglects natural disasters, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, Homeland suggests a place of deep unity, where we all come from, a kind of family, or at least what Robert Frost called home, the place where, when you go there, they have to take you in. What we have now is not that. Now, Homeland is a touchstone for a divided time, when we may be marked as strangers by anything from where we live, to how we dress, to what we fear, often one another, fellow Americans. Some have more to fear than others. 10 days before I sat down to write this, officers from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, arrested Samuel Oliver Bruno, a non-citizen who had been in sanctuary in a Durham church for nearly a year, who had left the church under pastoral escort to apply for a stay of deportation, and whose family and life had been in Durham for 20 years. I lived and taught in Durham for 15 years, ending in the winter of 2018 to 2019, and friends of mine were arrested while peacefully trying to stop the ICE vehicle that took him away. As I write, their legal defense is being prepared, and Oliver Bruno is being processed for deportation in Atlanta. This is the condition of our homeland security. This land holds us together and apart, insecure. This book's themes are how American Earth has always held the people on it apart together, and how the borders at the country's edges and the border lines that fracture the homeland are linked in a single web. The country began as both a world historical land grab and a world historical experiment in Republican self-rule. The Declaration of Independence stakes its insurrectionary claim on the equality of all men and on the colonists' right to push their settlement beyond the Allegheny Front, where the Crown had set a border in 1763 in deference to French and indigenous claims. George Washington and Henry David Thoreau saw many things differently, but both were land surveyors. The land was the commonwealth that held together the lives of presidents and dissidents in a country led to independence by its single largest speculator in land. But despite what the commonwealths of Massachusetts and Virginia called themselves, the Commonwealth never became a real commonwealth. Instead, relations to the land formed borderlines. Colonists justified taking the land of indigenous people by insisting that only settlers and farmers could properly own and rule a terrain. They claimed the place with axes, plows, and surveyors' lines. From the beginning, speculative capital swelled frontier land claims in cycles of boom and bust that never really ended. Washington's will, executed in 1800, disposed of more than 52,000 acres of land. 216 years later, a minority of the country's voters elected a real estate developer as tribune of American greatness. Land is perennially the thing we share that holds us apart. Its ownership means power for some over others, down through time from sharecroppers within living memory outside Chapel Hill to migrant laborers working in the chicken factories and hog compounds of eastern North Carolina today. Ownership is the beginning of credit, the way to turn a modest claim on the world into a grander one, the fulcrum of what is aptly called leverage, the Archimedean power that moves the world. Owning nothing means having to make wealth out of your own hide. The land is sorted into those who own the places where they live, those who own another's place, like the companies that hold Appalachian coal and Carolina hogs and chickens. Hold, an odd word for unembodied entities controlling the work of other hands, and those who work there on the sufferance of at-will hiring and firing. This unequal power does not mean that all is animosity and alienation. It is entirely human to love a place where you are in some way bound, to find kinds of freedom and pride in a place that confines you. I know from family stories that my wife's grandfather, a union coal miner all his life, and, among other things, a gravedigger when the mines weren't hiring, he knew how to make a hole in the earth, loved to be underground, loved the darkness, coolness, and closeness of the mine, until black lung disease made him too weak to work. It is human to love the thing that is killing you and to find peace in it. Home is whatever land you have dug yourself into. But this homeland has never been a commonwealth. Wealth comes from Middle English roots meaning well-being or wellness, a condition of happiness and good fortune closely aligned with health. It was not until the late Middle Ages that it took on its definite sense of financial or material riches. Common derives from French origins meaning shared by all. Because it is egalitarian, it has often been on the receiving end of aristocratic scorn. Common is also low, unrefined, undistinguished, earthy. So Walter Raleigh, the courtier and double-fisted colonizer who planted migrants in Ulster and Virginia, defined Commonwealth scornfully as a deprivation, the government of the whole multitude of the base and poorer sort, without respect of the other orders. John Locke, by contrast, defined it as any independent community, a self-governing polity that might be a monarchy, a democracy, or anything else. But there is an older sense of commonwealth that means the general good, or the well-being of the whole community, the flourishing that is shared and open to all. These are pretty phrases, or at least they appeal to me. But what exactly should they mean? A place to start might be what the United States has often promised and sometimes delivered to its insiders, the ones who have been counted as full members in the community. A share of the world, dignity in their work or in the condition that keeps them from working, the respect of officials and the law, the expectation that they can walk without fear or shame in any public place, confidence that they will get care when they are sick or hurt. This is an ideal of freedom in everyday activity, in work and play, that you find honorable, delightful, beautiful, worthwhile. With these quick brushstrokes, I am trying to indicate the elements of well-being that a community can extend or withhold. The more widely it extends them, the more it achieves the rudiments of a commonwealth, an equality deeper than being free to lose in a hyper-competitive economy. There is another, even deeper level to the commonwealth ideal. A commonwealth might be an economy where no one gets their living by degrading someone else, nor by degrading the health of the land or the larger living world. In such a community, the flourishing of everyone and everything would sustain the flourishing of each person. This would be a way of living in deep reciprocity, as well as deep equality. The freedom of that community would not be freedom from the consequences of your actions. It would not be freedom from dependence on others or from responsibility for them. It would be the freedom of being able to approve the results of what you do, to own your responsibilities and dependencies without too much grief or resentment. The United States is so far from being this sort of commonwealth that even trying to imagine it may seem pointless. But versions of it are the promise that leaders and prophets have made again and again, at least to those insiders who have counted as real Americans. The Commonwealth is the promise of Abraham Lincoln's 1858 claim before the Wisconsin Agricultural Society that in a democracy, no one should do degrading work, and everyone should have the chance to use both head and hands. Why else, Lincoln asked, do we have both? It is also the promise of the cooperative commonwealth of laborer owners, that parts of the early labor movement pursued. It's the spirit of Lyndon Johnson's 1965 plea for a great society, where the meaning of our lives matches the marvelous products of our labor, and the economy serves not only the needs of the body and demands of commerce, but the desire for beauty and the hunger for community. It was the radical vision that Martin Luther King Jr.'s ally Bayard Rustin advanced in the same year when he called for a second wave of the civil rights movement, calling for public works and training, for national economic planning, for federal aid to education, for attractive public housing, all adding up to a security of abundance. The American Commonwealth has been blocked again and again by division and exploitation, by racism, misshapen ideas of manhood and of women, and the subtle and outright violence of owners and bosses, usually all interwoven. Much American energy, political, emotional, legal, imaginative, has gone into creating classes of people who are supposedly suited for bad work. Much has gone into making bad work that shapes the people who are pulled into it. This history, still living, still deadly, from hog farms to coalfields to places without work, can make the idea of a commonwealth seem entirely idle, a story for those who are caught in what Ta-Nehisi Coates calls the dream, a blinkered fantasy of America as an untroubled home. After all, the history of this continent's past 5 centuries is woven from fantasy on the one hand, and the relentless and often inhumane and destructive extraction of wealth on the other. The land was ours before we were the land's, the line from The Gift Outright, which Robert Frost recited spontaneously at John F. Kennedy's inauguration, after losing his prepared Augustan doggerel in the winter sunshine and wind, is chilling in its accuracy. The dominant American claim has always been that the place belonged only incidentally to the peoples who had been here for thousands of years, and fundamentally to the settlers. As strangers, white settlers laid claim to the place. After the land itself, the other great extraction of wealth was from the labor of enslaved people. In some southern states, a settler could claim extra acreage under state settlement laws for every enslaved person he promised to bring onto the land. The plantations of the Deep South were built by what historian Sven Beckert calls war capitalism, the mobilization of the enslaved against the forests and swamps of the region, housed in camps far from any family, with huge death rates. The differential violence that molds white, black, and brown bodies to the concrete abstractions of race and caste is also written on the land, and how people are distributed across it, who owns it, and who can imagine after a few generations that their people have a claim that is nearly primordial and even in harmony with the expectations of the place itself. After the frontier came redlining. Not long ago in Durham, you could map the demographics of the city across an image of the Federal Housing Authority's loan segregation maps from 80 years ago. This has changed in recent years in a wave of gentrification in which colorblind markets have replaced poorer Black and Latino residents with whiter and wealthier people, almost as systematically as segregation once did, albeit with more nuance and deniability. You can spot the historically favored neighborhoods from above because willow oaks were planted along those streets 80 years ago, creating a green canopy over the white boulevards whose absence alerts you when you have crossed the old color line, giving Jim Crow an ecological echo. This is a material story with an ecological face. For the median American household today, 2/3 of net worth is home equity. In 2015, the rate of Black American home ownership was 40%, compared to 70% for white Americans. The average white household controls 7 times as much wealth as the average Black household, the median white household 11 times more. The land and the wealth that began in it still carry the shape of history. The chasm between white and black wealth is rooted in control of property, and it abides there. The land remembers. But what do we remember of it? Every political contest over claims on the land is, in part, a contest over what will be remembered and what will be forgotten. With forgetting, the way things are sinks into the land itself, as if it became nature. There are many ways to claim a terrain, by force and by the force of imagination, by cartography and by storytelling. Settlers made indigenous Americans into a kind of narrative resource, a flexible key to imagining ways of being the land's, ways of belonging to a conquered place. Even before Thomas Jefferson's continental catalogers Meriwether Lewis and William Clark documented with aesthetic precision the beautiful and sublime features of the West that would later become the sacred places in American scenery, the partisan Jeffersonian poet Philip Freneau was pioneering the long literary tradition of the picturesque savage in the Indian burying ground. By midnight moons o'er moistening dews, in habit for the chase arrayed, the hunter still the deer pursues, the hunter and the deer a shade. And long shall timorous fancy see the painted chief and pointed spear, and reason's self shall bow the knee to shadows and delusions here. Freneau published these lines in the 1780s, before the U.S. Constitution was ratified, more than a century before the U.S. Army's massacre of the Lakota at Wounded Knee. If white settlers were extracting wealth from the land before they developed any idea of how to fit into it, the less poetic rendering of Frost's line, then in poems and imagination the sequence was reversed. They were extracting the raw material of nostalgia and myth from indigenous people a century before they completed their conquest. American nostalgia and romanticism were being prepared even amid an increasingly unequal series of border wars to claim the continent. The Boy Scouts were founded in 1910, partly on the idea that young men would acquire American virtue by learning the austere disciplines and woodcraft of little savages, in co-founder Ernest Thompson Seton's phrase. Even today, a writer as thoughtful as Wendell Berry can imagine the continent's first people as living harmoniously in the maidenhood of our world, a moral and imaginative resource for ecologists today. This is not a morality tale. The point is not to moralize, it is a material story, an accounting of how this familiar world was made that both illuminates and rebuts the morality tales that have attached to this place. It is a story about the terms of land-making that made American wealth so unequal, uncommon. This history puts a heavy burden on the idea of an American commonwealth. It confirms that what Americans inherit in common is terribly unequal and compromised, all the way back to the first settlers who called the place by its new name, the name of Amerigo Vespucci, the Italian cartographer known for mapping it, as if we called Antarctica Fab, for the Russian-backed explorer Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen, or Australia Jimmy for Captain James Cook. By the same token, the history highlights why it matters that a commonwealth is not a gauzy, utopian ideal. It is radical and practical. This unequal history is only prelude. The global ecological crisis that is now unfolding will grow and shapeshift for all the lives that anyone who hears this will ever know or care for, and much longer. The ways the planet has turned against us, grown smaller and angrier and more erratic, are all human creations. Most of all, the creations of the past and present inhabitants of North America and Europe, and now billions in China and the rest of the newly industrialized world. People whose lives are already entangled ecologically and economically will be thrown together in new ways when refugees from storms and droughts and resource wars crash against the gates of Europe and the United States, when one country and then another tries its own version of geoengineering on behalf of the globe. This crisis may show up, too, in new exercises of force and claims to rule. Will there be a blockade of Brazil to stop its fascist-styling government from bulldozing the Amazon and collapsing the lungs of Earth's atmosphere? Will African countries with vast, fertile farmland under long-term Chinese lease assert sovereignty to break the leases in a food crisis? Will New Zealanders vote to close their airports to Silicon Valley riches and hedge funders looking for a stable place to ride out the end of civilization? Already, climate denialism in the United States is less about science than about who rules you. It is a way of rejecting the claims of foreigners, international institutions, more imagined than real, and the global poor, and holding on to a narrow sovereignty that the tides are threatening to wash away. The wall at the Mexican border and the Donald Trump administration's cuts in asylum for refugees are announcement that the world's problems will not be allowed to become American problems, but that almost metaphysical American exceptionalism is a bad joke, or, like many wild threats, it seems it must be a joke until it turns violent. The question is not whether the world's problems will become everyone's problems, but on what terms they will. Militarized borders, resource wars, and inequality that grows as its ecological and economic faces interact. These are the features of a re-barbarized world, in which people and peoples do not even try to live in reciprocity or aim at any shared horizon beyond the ecological scarcity that presses down inequitably on everyone. The ways the world's respectable powers have been pretending to build a global commonwealth by growth and trade have brought us here. Although the polite official response to global inequality is still to regret it and seek ways to mitigate it, the rising political tide is a cruder and more candid call to maintain your own relatively and temporarily secure place in it against whoever would take it away. There is neither time enough nor world enough, we would need several worlds with comparable resources, to grow and trade our way to a global capitalist version of Commonwealth. But the notorious fact that in the long run we are all dead, and so is the world, has become a perverse source of comfort to those who think they can ride out disaster long enough for their own purposes until their own lights go out. So there it is. To adapt an old slogan, Commonwealth or barbarism. Either the world's economies turn to a new reckoning over what is most worth doing with finite and fragile places, and with brief and vulnerable lives, or we careen into a future that betrays the Commonwealth idea again and again. A Commonwealth politics today has to ask what wealth itself is and what is the value of life. It has to give answers that people can live by together. Otherwise, we will have made ourselves one another's enemies. Fault lines and armored borders and strongmen will seem the simple necessaries of survival. If there are no Commonwealth politics to bend our efforts and imagination toward, those of us who enjoy some freedom and small power in this world will have to choose between cynically hoarding a chance at half-decent survival for our own families and closest allies, or nihilistically watching crises crash at the walls of this unequal world, savoring the small satisfaction of having seen it coming. Neither is a way to wish to live. Having gone briefly global, let me turn back now to the main concern of this short book, understanding the crises of American life in terms of the meaning of this land, the value of these lives, here for the people who believe they have a homeland in this country, and others who feel they live here in a sort of exile, strangers in the land, and the many of us who feel sometimes one way, sometimes the other, often both at once. I return here because, although there is need for politics on the global scale, it does not exist yet, and efforts to take it into being are mostly vapid. If it does come into being, it will be in relation to, often emerging out of, national, regional, and local politics where feeling and power are already concentrated, articulate, able to make things happen. The existence of problems on a global scale doesn't imply that politics must also take that scale. This is a common fallacy, so easy it can seem inevitable. But a world order can be built from an alliance of commonwealths, probably more readily than as a single, literally utopian, no-place commonwealth. In any event, it is easier to see that far. This book begins from what is already in common, divisive and impoverishing as it sometimes is. The chapters that follow across a series of landscapes, the next one, This Land is Our Land, explores conflicts over whose land this is, and what it means for the land to be ours by way of two places where nationalism and nature have come together recently, the public lands of the American West and the Appalachian coalfields, battleground of the war on coal. Reckonings goes to places where the land and built environment are dangers, sources of vulnerability and repositories of harm, to consider how irresponsible and indifferent power remakes the land and the people on it. Losing a Country meditates on the ways that familiar places felt newly dangerous, strange, and comfortless in the winter of 2016 to 2017, and on what it means to understand yourself as both endangered and part of the threat in a hazardous place. The World We Have Built draws back to consider the most consequential landscapes of the 21st century, the vast second nature of infrastructure and human institutions which mutely direct the fate of the world. The final chapters, the long environmental justice movement and the value of life, begin to map a politics for remaking the world we have built and turning the future of life toward an economy and ecology of common care. Finally, these chapters track me from the North Carolina Piedmont, where I lived for 15 years, to New York City, where I typed the final words in this book. In those years I got to know, and finally to identify with, a region and history different from the ones I had known, Appalachian and Northeastern. I walked there, voted, planted food, was arrested at the state capitol with the Moral Mondays movement, and came to think of my life as entangled with the life of the place. I had the privilege of neighboring, in place if not time, the activist, legal scholar, and priest Pauli Murray, who has been recently discovered with a retrospective New Yorker profile and a Yale College named in her honor, but has been treasured in Durham for a long time. Some days I thought I saw Durham's Jim Crow segregated cemeteries and the poor bottomlands where her family lived through her descriptions of walking them as a child. With her, I thought about how the extraordinary work that she called a ministry of human flourishing could arise from such a superficially unpromising place, one that the writer Joan Didion had passed through as a child with no recollection except that the other children there ate red clay dirt from under their porches. The discipline of living there was to see much more than that, and this book is, among other things, a thanks and farewell, for now, to a place where I learned new ways of seeing. It is strange and ironic to finish these words far from a place I learned to call home. 1. This land is our land. What is the nature of our civic enmity? How do people who live together come to see one another as enemies? Not surprisingly, given the situation that makes this question urgent, there is no agreement on the answer. There is a pastoral centrist view, still in evidence in patches of op-ed pages and short-lived presidential candidacies, that the idea of Americans being one another's enemies is a fever symptom caused by a disease called polarization. We can hope to wake up, after thrashing in the dark for a while, with cool brows and a new narrative of civic friendship in our heads. Or maybe, instead, the enmity is a matter of some people starting to see what many others have known for a long time, that depending on who you are, the police are dangerous, the courthouse is a menace, the official statues are civic graffiti and insults, that
Sample complete. Ready to continue?